Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and it's great to be with you today to do this thing that we call apologetics, learning how to explain, defend the faith with clarity, charity, confidence, and with a whole lot of fun besides. And we've had, so far, a great week here on the show. Lots of great speakers, interesting topics. And today we're going to finish off the week strong. Whenever you're doing a workout routine, you always want to finish strong. And we're going to do that with our good friend, master apologist, Karl Keating. He's going to be coming on the show. We're going to continue our discussion about classic apologetic works that, unfortunately, they sit on a lot of library bookshelves collecting dust when they really should be being read by all those interested in explaining and defending the faith. And each month, Karl comes on the show. We talk about a classic work because we want to give you only the best. And today's classic work that we're going to talk about is Hilaire Bellocs, How the Reformation Happened. So he will be coming on the other side of the break. And by the way, I also want to mention a couple of special events coming up with Virgin Most Powerful Radio. If you guys haven't registered, you need to. We're going to have an awesome men's conference with Jesse Romero, Ruben Nava, and Tim Gordon. And that's going to be June 13th, Saturday, June 13th. Put that on your calendars, folks. And also, this is going to be cool. Our good friend Steve Ray is going to give a virtual pilgrimage for Virgin Most Powerful Radio on June 20th. Saturday, June 20th. So 2 important dates to put on your apologetics calendar, folks. Sign up, get involved. The men's conference with Jesse, Ruben, and Tim, and also the virtual pilgrimage with Steve Ray. So you want to check that out. And lest I forget, I want to give my shout-outs to all of you watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. Good to see familiar names there. And also, I want to welcome all of you tuning in on radio around the country and also via podcast around the world. So welcome aboard, folks. And, yeah, it should be a 2-hour program. It really should, especially with Karl on board. And welcome aboard, and it's great to be with you. And, by the way, if you have any questions for Karl, you could call us 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. Or you can send your emails at questions@handsonapologetics.com. That's the official dojo mailbox. And at the corner of my eye, I'm just seeing flashes of huge emoji explosions from our social media section of the dojo. So, hey, thanks, everybody. Looks like everybody's in good spirits, for Friday. So let's keep that upbeat feeling going. As always, each episode we look at finding the fallacy. And for Fridays, we switch things up. Today's, we usually, instead of doing informal fallacy, we usually look at a propaganda technique. And that's what we're going to do today. The propaganda technique is the Snob appeal technique. We also meet an early church father every episode, and today's early church father is a father near and dear to my heart because I just have this incredible interest on the Old Testament canon. And this particular early church father is instrumental in proclaiming the Christian canon, both the Old and New Testaments, and that is Pope St. Damasus I. Pope St. Damasus I. So we'll learn a little bit about this incredibly important and famous pope. And let's see, I'm trying to think here. Did I do all the dojo preps for our workout? Phone, email, website. I didn't give you the website, official website. If maybe you can't hear the whole program and you want to hear all the incredible insights that Karl Keating usually brings to bear on these classics. You could always go to our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. And there you can access all the shows. You can listen to the rest of the show in the privacy of your own home or earbuds or phone or a car or whatever, Or you can also listen over our handy-dandy phone app. If you haven't got the phone app, you really should, because there is a lot of good free goodies on the phone app that I think you'd use quite a bit. So, yeah, we're going to have a great show. I'm already looking at the forum. There's going to be great conferences coming up in June. So, lots of things to look forward to. So don't get despondent, folks. If you're stationed in place because of the COVID stuff, remember we could always do apologetics in place. Use social media, tell people about the program. And I want to thank everybody for doing that, because just looking at the subscriptions, I've noticed that it's working, that people are getting the message, they're tuning into the show, and really appreciate that. So please keep up the good work. All right. Why don't we jump to the Finding the Fallacy? Like I said, it's a propaganda technique. And this propaganda technique, I'm sure all of you have been exposed to it. It's called Snob appeal. Snob appeal refers to qualities or attributes of a product that may appeal to a consumer with snobby taste, I guess you could probably say. It may refer to an actual product itself or the exclusivity of the consumer for a potential experience as a result of owning the product as being advertised. And snob appeal occurs a lot in commercials, usually celebrity endorsements. They try to associate, the hoi polloi, high living type thing with usually a pretty mundane product, And the idea is, if you want to be part of the upper class, if you want to be part of the, look down upon your neighbors with pride because you're using a certain deodorant, that's when they appeal to the snob appeal. They try to associate it with it. And like I said, it occurs a lot in commercials and advertising. It actually does occur quite a bit in apologetics, especially when a certain group, and I'm not going to name the group, but there is a certain group out there who kind of try to present themselves as the knowing ones, the smart ones, the smarties. And that's really snob appeal, because it makes people who want to think of themselves as smart to be inclined to join the group or believe what they believe or propound, just so that they could be part of the snobby class, so to speak. But so it does have an application within the apologetic world and religious dialogue and stuff like that. But it certainly is a very big feature in terms of advertising. And the cool thing, folks, as I say every Friday, with propaganda techniques, once you realize it's being used on you, its magic goes away. There's you're immune to its power. In fact, usually it backfires. And not only are you immune to the power, but you also tend to be more critical of the person trying to employ the propaganda technique. And that's our Finding the Fallacy for today, our propaganda technique, which is snob appeal. All right, why don't we jump to the early church father for today? Today's early church father is Pope St. Damasus I, who reigned between AD 366 and 384. Now, Pope St. Damasus I is remembered for having commissioned St. Jerome to translate the Scriptures. The Scriptures at that time were circulated in the Latin-speaking West, according to what's known as the Old Latin translation. And the problem was, over a couple centuries of circulation and copying and recopying, manuscripts of the Old Latin became messy. There were lots of corruptions, lots of disagreements among various manuscripts. And so the Pope wanted St. Jerome, who was unique in the ancient world because he knew Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, to make a fresh translation of the Scriptures, and that's what eventually becomes the Latin Vulgate. So Pope St. Damasus I is responsible for the commission of the Vulgate, By the way, Vulgate simply means common. And the funny thing is the Old Latin was known as the Vulgate as well. But we tend to associate the Bible that comes from Jerome as the Vulgate. So just FYI there. Anyway, and he's also responsible for changing the liturgical language in the Roman Church from Greek to Latin. Now remember that, folks. Latin is not the original language of the Roman Catholic Church. Liturgically, it was originally Greek. And I guess if you went even further, you could probably even say Aramaic or Hebrew. But yeah, Pope St. Damasus was a revisionist, and he's the one that gave us the Latin liturgy. He's interested himself in adorning the tombs of the martyrs and composed numerous metrical epitaphs, generally referred to as epigrams. And he had engraved on marble slabs by a very skilled calligrapher, Furius Dionysius Philcalis. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And there are actually 59 such epigrams that have been accepted as authentic. So this early church father didn't just leave writings. He left monuments, with his own inscriptions. Among Damasus's literary works that remained, the epigrams, there's also 10 letters and synodal encyclicals. And, of course, the most important of all of them is what's known as the Faith, or the Tomos Damasus, or the Tome of Damasus. And let's talk a little bit about that. I think I could squeeze this in, the Tome of Damasus. St. Ambrose of Milan was instrumental in having a council met in Rome, hoping to obtain the intestine of Maximus of Constantinople. Oh, I can't. I hear the music coming up. Anyway, maybe next week I'll talk a little bit more about the Tome of Damasus, because we got to get ready for Karl Keating, who's coming up on the other side of the break. We're going to talk about Bellocs and how the Reformation happened.
Leviticus 11:44 says, "Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy." St. Vincent Pallotti said, "You must be holy in the way God asks you to be holy." God does not ask you to be a Trappist monk or a hermit. He wants you to sanctify the world and your everyday life. May God show us the path to holiness and help us to follow it all the days of our life.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby? She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl? We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special. You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor? Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2727. 2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands On Apologetics. And we're going to continue our series looking at classic apologetic works with the classic apologist himself, Karl Keating. By the way, Karl Keating is the founder of Catholic Answers, and nowadays he's a full-time author. He's written so far 16 books on all sorts of subjects. Of course, we're all familiar with his Catholicism Fundamentalism, Debating Catholicism series, Book for Life, No Apology. He also writes in several other genres like religion, literature, outdoors, self-publishing, and the like. And you can check out all his great stuff, not only on Amazon, but also karlkeating.com. And Karl Keating, welcome to Hands On Apologetics.
Gary, it's great to be back with you for another one of our looks at a classic work of apologetics.
Yes, indeed. And this particular author, he's quite an author in apologetics, Hilaire Belloc.
Indeed. I have. It's an interesting coincidence. The next 2 or 3 days, I'm going to be writing a 1,500-word piece, an article on Belloc for an upcoming Dictionary of Christian Apologists and Their Critics.
Oh, wow.
Which this will be coming out from the Talbot School of Theology of Biola University. It's an evangelical institution, well respected. And I was asked to write the piece on Belloc. And you'll be interested to know, Gary, that I was also open to another apologist that we already have discussed on previous programs, Arnold Lunn.
Nice.
And it turns out that the professor who is in charge of this project himself is doing the piece on Lunn, and it has shared with me that and did a good job on it, by the way. So even though it's a Protestant institution, it looks like this dictionary of apologetics is going to be a fine publication.
Yes.
So,
boy, that's exciting.
Anyway, yeah. So I've got several books in front of me, Belloc related, so I can look up this little entry. So it's quite appropriate that today we talk about one of his many, many books. And I mean many. You mentioned that I've got 16 books. That's only barely 10% of what he wrote. I just now, a few minutes ago, have been going through the complete bibliography, and he wrote no fewer than 150 books.
Wow.
Plus entries for other books and prefaces and pamphlets and so on. But 150 books. Belloc, I think we ought to explain a bit who he was, lived from 1870 to 1953. So a long life of 83 years. His writing life began shortly before the turn of the century. His first book was actually a poetry book in 1896. And then he wrote until he was felled by a stroke in the early 1940s. So his last book was actually in 1942. So, so he had about 45 or so years of writing, 150 books. That's 3 books a year average.
Wow.
But they were all over the place. We call him for this program an apologist, but he's mainly writing on things that we wouldn't so much consider directly apologetics, but most of them had to do with the Catholic faith, or more particularly with Catholic history and Catholic personalities over the centuries.
Yeah. It's, as you were saying that, I was thinking, first I thought, wow, that's great that you're doing that article, but boy, that's going to be hard to squeeze in all the information about Belloc in such a short space.
Have to be very selective. Unfortunately, they're not expecting a comprehensive piece in 1,500 words. As I was going through this bibliography of his a few minutes ago, I noticed, for example, in the 3 years from 1908 through 1910, which when he was at the height of his powers then and for the next decade or so, he wrote in those 3 years 15 books. And some of them were very particular. For example, there's a biography of Marie Antoinette. And but a number of them were collections of miscellaneous writings he had done for various publications, and he gives some interesting titles to them. He's got, over those years, he's got a series of 4 books that they're titled On Nothing, On Everything, On Anything, On Something. And I think I've got at least one of those at home, and it's, a collection of miscellaneous items. So some of Bellocs' works were intensive, focused on one subject. Many of them were collections of his ephemeral writings, and he wrote a lot. He was one of those people who actually had to write to live. So far as I can tell, except when he was a very young man, maybe in doing some manual labor someplace, he never had a normal job in any sense. He actually had to write for periodical publications or books in order to make money to live on. So he was always semi-desperate to get the next piece of writing out.
Right. Yeah, that explains why he's so prodigious in his authorship. Is, to put food on the table, he's got to produce. And what's amazing, though, is his writings aren't, what do I want to say, like real thin, and off the top of the head. They're meaty writings. They're not lightweight by any stretch of the imagination.
No, but it's very interesting in that one of the big criticisms about Belloc over the decades, especially his historical works and biographical works, and there's so many of those, is that he never followed normal scholarship. You almost never will find a footnote or a bibliographic reference. He was so widely read, he would dictate to his secretary his books, just off the top of his head. Matter of fact, let me read a little bit here from the biography of Belloc by historian A.N. Wilson. It came out a few decades ago. But Wilson just finishes talking about the tough life and conditions that Belloc had to work under. And he says, needless to say, the work produced under such conditions was of a very uneven quality. In order to pay for living expenses, he allowed himself to be signed up for far too many books. Most of them were dictated with no previous research or preparation. And although they are tributes to his almost preternatural fluency and eloquence, they are inevitably patchy. Nevertheless, even in his work of a later period, the breadth as well as the quantity of his writing is remarkable. And he mentions here in 2 years, 1928, 1929, where in those years alone, he wrote 2 fattish volumes of his History of England, biographies of King James II and Joan of Arc, 3 or 4 novels, a travel book, several works of apologetics, including Survivals and New Arrivals, and the one we're talking about today, How the Reformation Happened. So Belloc was a wonderful stylist. You read his books, and even though in a certain sense they're thick because they have a lot of information, they're always very readable, never academic in their tone or style. These are, I won't say that they're always unputdownable, but they are never putdownable, okay, if I may put it that way.
Right.
He's never a boring writer.
Yeah, and probably, I imagine, because his livelihood depended on people buying his books, that he learned how to, kind of like how, Frank Sheed with the Catholic Apologetics Guild learned how to keep an audience. He knew how to write to engage the reader.
Yes, but without compromise about his principles or the point he's trying to get across. And Belloc, that applies both to Sheed and to Belloc. So Belloc certainly was aiming for a popular audience. I mean, many of his books had their roots in articles he would write for Catholic publications such as Damasus and national Catholic newspapers. He wrote a lot on economics. He, along with G.K. Chesterton, was one of the top thinkers about the so-called distributivist movement, which tried to sort of reform of early capitalism to spread out the ownership of the means of production to small level folks, whether tenant farmers or small businessmen or so on, rather than having capital agglomerated into gigantic corporations over which, the regular workers had no influence at all. So he wrote on economics. He wrote on, many biographies. He wrote some novels. At one point, he wrote what's reputed to be a very fine story called Belinda, and yet he wrote that at a time when he was engaged in really rough controversy with others. In fact, one of the controversies that I'll be mentioning in this dictionary piece that I'm doing the next few days is his dispute with H.G. Wells, the best known as a science fiction novelist for War of the Worlds, but also as a sort of popular historian. And Wells, in around 1920, wrote a very popular book called The Outline of History, which in the U.S. and Britain became sort of the go-to account of world history for average folks. But Belloc just took it apart in a whole book because of its clear anti-Catholic bias. Wells responded in a book of his own. Belloc wrote another book against that. So, he would when Belloc got his jaw on a particular bone, he didn't let go.
Yeah, about what time period was that?
Those books were written in the 1920s.
Okay.
And I'm pleased to say that I've got the three of them, the one by Wells and the two by Belloc. And when I was younger, I did have a copy of Wells' Outline of History, although I loaded that many years ago. But at that point, I didn't realize so much his bias. Wells was a very secular person. Matter of fact, in World War II, and at this point it was too late for Belloc to reply because of his stroke already. But about 1944, Wells wrote a book advocating that the Allies blow Rome up to smithereens, not so much to get rid of the fascist government of Mussolini, but to destroy the Catholic Church. And he was very clear on that. That's the whole purpose of what he wanted. So Wells was really a vile man, even though he wrote early on in his life, 40 years earlier, 50 years earlier, he wrote some engaging stories, such as The War of the Worlds. But in terms of philosophy and religion, he was very anti-religion, especially anti-Catholicism. And he literally wanted the Vatican to be blown up and reduced to ashes.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that. But I also didn't know about this controversy between Belloc and Wells, so that's going to have to be on my to-get list, my wish list. I hear the music coming up. We're chatting with Karl Keating about apologetic classics, and we're talking about Hilaire Belloc's How the Reformation Happened. So we'll talk about that coming up on the other side of the break. Stay tuned.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR, live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin's Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, A portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio, and it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics, and we're chatting with Karl Keating about the classic work, Bellocs, How the Reformation Happened. And, 150 books and include all sorts of genres. What do you know? What was the motivation for him writing How the Reformation Happened?
You know, I don't know that there was any particular thing that got him going on this. In that, he wrote it sort of actually the second half of his writing career. You know, it was a little more than a dozen years before he had a stroke. But by this time, he had already been writing and reading a lot about the Reformation, and he had referenced it in many other works, biographies of some of the characters and other historical things. We're talking about Belloc today as an apologist. I think it's probably better to think of him more as a Catholic historian of a popular or casual sort. His interest was in the history of Christendom. One of the curious things, by the way, in his writings is that you can read them through and you almost never come across the name Jesus or the title Christ. Belloc almost always is referring, even in his controversial works, to the church and Christendom and so on. He's not a theologian. You never mix him up with Thomas Aquinas, say, and he didn't have the interest in that the way that his great friend G.K. Chesterton did. You know, Chesterton wrote a thin book of biography of Aquinas called the Damasus, which was Aquinas' nickname when he was a monk, But and that book was so on point about Aquinas that Etienne Gilson, who was a great, more recent Thomistic scholar, said it was the best book ever written on Thomas, and it was by a non-specialist, Chesterton. So Chesterton could go more into the theology of things, even though he himself was not a scholar in the standard sense of the term, and he didn't use footnotes and that kind of stuff. But Chesterton had more of a theological grasp, where Belloc was more historical, and he saw the large movements in history, and he wanted to explain them, sometimes with an overview, as in this book, sometimes in other books by looking at the personalities involved. When Belloc was young, although he was British, he did his military service in France. And that military service got him in the habit, for military-related history, of never writing about a battle unless he could actually walk the battlefield first to see what the soldiers would have seen. And that, he said, made a big difference. He wasn't an armchair historian. And so it is even with his church history. He would go and look at the places where things occurred, the castles and so on, that things may have happened. And all that would be part of what he was writing about. It put things in physical, geographical context for him. And that was, what he did for a good part of what shows up in How the Reformation Happened. A book, by the way, that the New York Times said that Hilaire Belloc has written a fine and stimulating book full of persuasive charm. But, you might not find it so charming if you happen to be a Protestant, because it came out quite strongly against Protestantism as not so much a theological blunder as a historical blunder.
Interesting. Yeah. So if someone picks up the book How the Reformation Happened, they shouldn't expect a history of philosophy or theology per se, but it's more of from a historical point of view.
No, it's been a while since I looked at the book. I don't even recollect if Belloc makes a reference to salvation by faith alone, or sola fide, certain things that came up as Protestant catchwords at the time. But he is looking here at how was it possible that the Christendom of the Renaissance, which seemed so vibrant, could in so many areas collapse and split within just a handful of years, within a lifetime, really. He says in his introductory section, the Reformation did not continue a direct Renaissance tendency toward larger things. It deflected that tendency. It did not introduce the arts. It cramped and thwarted them. Its last effects have not led to a society happy or stable. They've led to the society we see around us today. Remember, this is 1929. So, Belloc is looking here at why did Christendom fall apart? And his chief emphasis in this book is on the situation in England, although he looks at, France and Scotland and the Netherlands, also. It's not a complete attempt to weigh all of, how Calvinism differed from Lutheranism, from Anglicanism, and so on. His main look was in his own backyard, and he wanted to figure out what, not so much processes of history, because that makes it almost sound like a personification of history, but what occurred historically, coming from personalities who made the history, to end up this way. And of course, he looks a lot at Henry VIII and those who followed him in his line.
Interesting. Yeah, because like you said, that's kind of his own backyard. It's part of the air he breathed in England. So it's just naturally he would focus there.
Yeah, he's got a whole chapter on Calvin, because he thought more than Lutheranism that Calvinism was a blunder, because it got human nature so wrong. And so he's not looking so much at Calvinism as theological error, although that's, of course, part of it. But it's more almost a philosophical error of getting human nature wrong, and then, because of that, getting human society wrong and human government wrong, and Europe, Christendom collapsing into warring camps and staying that way for so long until there wasn't so much a resolution as just exhaustion on all sides.
Yeah. One question I have is with Hilaire Belloc, I know that he had a very concrete understanding of the Holy Roman Empire, and that in some sense the empire continued to exist long after a lot of historians, said it departed. Is that kind of one of the main motivating aspects of the book, is that he's kind of looking at the demise of what used to be Christendom?
Yes, because he did see Christendom as manifested, especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, as the culmination and naturally the historical successor of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, in his mind, got a lot right in terms of politics and social structure and so on. But, of course, it didn't have the advantage of revelation. And so after the empire collapsed, Christendom, which was just getting going at that point, developed and purified, in many respects, what Rome had, and then made this glorious civilization of the Middle Ages and beyond. And what struck Belloc was how the problems that existed from the first in Christianity in terms of heresies and underlying currents all tended to bubble up finally at the beginning of the Reformation, and just caused a universal disaster. So it's a good, as a story. It's a very interesting story to read this. I'm looking through my book, and I've not read this in some years. So I'm looking at the marginal notations I've made in pencil. And what I mean by that is when I find a passage that I want to get back to and recollect, I'll make a vertical line on the margin. If it's of particular importance, I'll put 2 vertical lines. If it's really important, I'll put 3 and maybe even an arrow. But I'm finding a lot of vertical lines in the margins here because there are many things many good points that Belloc brings out, or maybe just a way that he's saying something that is very perceptive, especially about human psychology. Why did Cromwell, why did Henry VIII, why did Calvin do what they did when they did it? What were their real motives? It wasn't when these guys were starting out. They weren't trying to purify some abstract theology that they might have found in the Summa Theologiae. It wasn't that. They had other motives that later on there were theological justifications worked up for them. But, Belloc is very clear in this book and in others that it wasn't theology that caused Henry VIII to inadvertently start a new church. It was something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk about rich biographical information to draw from, too. Henry himself is a figure larger than life. And in some ways, Luther and Calvin as well, that they weren't, like you said, they weren't just working in the abstract. There was a lot going on that shaped and molded the path that they eventually took.
Really, for example, Luther was, when he was a Catholic monk, was suffering under extreme scrupulosity. He would go to confession and not feel that he was authentically forgiven of his sins, this is a common problem with people who suffer from scrupulosity. And it was so psychologically debilitating to Luther that he eventually, when he rebelled, he chucked the whole idea of penitential forgiveness, sacramental forgiveness, because he personally never found a resolution in going to confession. He would come back from the confessional, no matter how hard he tried, having a sense that God hadn't really forgiven him. And so he lived with this psychological problem, and the only resolution he could find was one that took him out of the church and into a church of his own making.
Yeah, very good. We're chatting with Karl Keating about Hilaire Belloc's book, How the Reformation Happened. Stay tuned, folks. More to come on the other side of the break.
Welcome, Daniel. You're on the line. What's on your mind, brother?
Hi, I just wanted to share a testimony about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I had a buddy at work who, he's a lukewarm Catholic guy, and I wanted him to start listening to the Terry and Jesse show, so I kept telling him to download the app, and he kept putting me off. So one day, I grabbed his phone and I downloaded the app for him. I went on vacation, and I kept telling him to listen to it. He would kind of put me off. I came back from vacation. He comes to my cubicle, and he says to me, "Hey, man, I've been listening to Terry and Jesse's show, and it's great." And it's made a big impact in his life. The guy, he's going to weekly adoration a couple times a week. He goes to the Mass in the morning. He's an on-fire Catholic, and he promotes the Terry and Jesse show in the Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Daniel, what a testimony. And I want to encourage our listeners to get those cards by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and do what Daniel's doing. Go out and spread the faith by inviting people to listen to Virgin Most Powerful. Daniel, thanks for your testimony, brother. God love you.
You're welcome.
Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. Male and female he created them. According to Pope St. John the 23rd, It is not true that some human beings are by nature superior and others inferior. All human beings are equal in their natural dignity. May God help us to look upon everyone as a person created in His image and likeness, and treat everyone the same without favoritism or prejudice.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. And I just want to remind everyone to check your calendars, put down June 13th and June 20th, because June 13th is the men's conference. Virgin Most Powerful Radio is sponsoring with Jesse Romero, Ruben Nava, and Tim Gordon. And also June 20, we have our good friend Steve Ray, who's going to give us a virtual pilgrimage. So put that on your calendar. And, continuing our discussion with Karl Keating on Hilaire Belloc's classic work, How the Reformation Happened. Karl, so Martin Luther as a monk had a bad case of scrupulosity where even the best of his works weren't good enough. He'd always find fault. And so he thought some sort of theological resolution to it.
Yeah, and Calvin and Henry VIII and others, had their own problems that they sought resolution for. I mean, Henry's problems was with women, obviously, and although he didn't actually intend to start a new church, that was the end result. Right. So you've got with each of these originators of the different branches of Protestantism, you've got personal problems that they sort of unintentionally or unknowingly trying to resolve by destroying the religious situation. During the break, I was flipping through the book again, and I realized that in the introduction, Belloc explains sentence by sentence what he's going to do in the book. So maybe I can share a bit of that.
Okay.
He says, I shall begin by describing how United Christendom was growing unstable during the 3 generations between the Black Death in the early 16th century. So that's 1350 to 1500. So the social situation, he's saying, is bad. A lot of people died in the Black Death. That, of course, causes economic and political turmoil. So that was sort of the background to the Reformation. Then he says, I'll come next to the sudden flood of that revolt in the German state and cities after 1517. So 1517 is when Luther started his work, publicly, as a reformer. Then, said Belloc, I shall present that strange fatality, the political accident, whereby England, hitherto the least affected of all Christian provinces, was to face the new alien movement and to join it. And what happened there, he points to then from 1536 to 1540, is what's called the dissolution of the monasteries. So this was not a doctrinal thing. It was where Henry VIII, who separated from the Catholic Church effectively in 1535, over the next few years, at the instigation of his advisors, took church property, particularly monasteries, and kicked out the monks, and took those properties and passed the wealth out to his advisors and those in authority at various levels. Well, what you've got here is the beginning of a reformation, of a new church establishing, but not for theological reason, but because there was a chance for those in power to get vast wealth. Because the monasteries, each one of them would have acres and acres of land and farms and so on. They generated lots of wealth, and they didn't have to pay taxes to the king. So when Henry agreed to take over all the monasteries and divide them up among his cronies became fantastically wealthy. And in the process, they had more and more reason to turn against the church, so the church couldn't get its property back ever. And that was actually the origin, even more so than Henry's attempted divorce, in turning England into a Protestant country. Because originally Henry had come out against the Protestant Reformation, wrote a book about it. The Pope had called him the defender of the faith. And then some years later, he does this. Again, not in Henry's mind thinking he's going to start a new church, but that was the effect of it, that he was convinced by his advisors to take over the monasteries and other Catholic property. And it was an economic revolution in the country. And, and the theological disaster came in order to justify that.
Yeah. So in a sense, the only way to bring Catholicism back as it was would be to divest, all these people who came into all this wealth, that eventually they'd lose the property that was wrongly taken from the church.
Yeah, the irony of the thing, though, is that before this had happened, before the dissolution of the monasteries, the king not only was most powerful in the country in terms of his authority, but in terms of his wealth, too. There really wasn't anybody who could match him. But by the time this process was over in a number of years, most of the wealth didn't go to the king at all. It went to these other people, the aristocracy, who became fantastically wealthy. And you had a whole new political class looking after itself. And that was the determining thing for English history thereafter. And so the monarchy ends up becoming weakened because of the events that led ultimately to the Protestant Reformation in England. It didn't become strengthened. It became weakened over the centuries, whereas the aristocracy became stronger and stronger.
That's interesting. Also, one of the unintended fallouts of it, of the suppression of the monastery, is the care for the poor, because the monasteries were integral in caring for the poor. Once they're suppressed, that's when you start getting the poor taxes, the poor laws, and eventually the welfare state has to step in to take care of the poor, where that used to been that the church used to take care of it.
Yeah, you could look historically at what happened, say, a couple centuries later, in the 1700s rather than the 1500s. The poor were probably worse off then, although England as a whole was wealthier, because most of that wealth now is concentrated among, several dozen or several hundred families.
Yeah,
it didn't trickle down to the poor, and there was nothing like a social welfare net that the monasteries had provided throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period into the 16th century. So the poor were really left on their own. And imagine present-day homelessness by a factor of several. That's the kind of thing you'd find in cities throughout England at that time, in the 1700s.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really love about Belloc. He doesn't travel the well-traveled role of scholarship, but focused, almost entirely on Henry VIII's marriage or maybe the investiture problem. But there's this whole economic aspect as well that fueled the English Reformation.
Yeah, Belloc has always had a heart for the poor, but he never wore that heart on his sleeve, so to say. Okay, he was always in his mind thinking about the rich versus the poor, or the rich versus everybody else. It was said that at one point he went to give a lecture to a crowd of wealthy people, and he brought a very large wooden needle, a needle shaped out of wood, so a gigantic needle, and an India rubber camel. And he held them up in front of the audience and showed that the tiny camel made of rubber still wouldn't fit through this gigantic needle. Then going back to what our Lord was saying about the rich, So he was never averse to poking it at the rich, which he commonly did, at any point of history, any point of church history, his own time in the early 20th century, or all the way back to the Reformation era.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, you could see where distributism really is part of his worldview and how he views history, how he views, everyday life that imbues not only his works, but also the way he lives as well.
Yes, he's very much interested in personal liberty, but he thought that liberty could not be effected if there were great agglomerations of political power and wealth. And, of course, he was largely right in that. Now, whether distributism ever had any practical use, ever could be put into play practically, that's a separate question. But the fact that Belloc and Chesterton and others endorsed that kind of thinking was really a sign that they saw so many dislocations socially in the economic and political systems of their time. And they were searching for something that would honor human dignity and would recognize that work is a good thing. Now, we often think of work as something we're just stuck doing. But man was made to work, and there's an honor in doing honorable work. And Belloc commonly, wrote about it. He wrote entire books on economic theory. And when we look at those, we see how dedicated he was to having regular folks not just have economic security, but have kind of value in their lives for doing honest labor.
Yeah, very good. Do you know if how the Reformation happened? Is that still in print?
It is. As a matter of fact, I think a few years ago, Ignatius Press republished it.
Okay.
I may have that wrong, but I know I did see a newish copy fairly recently. My copy is one from quite a long time ago. But anyway, it's still available, How the Reformation Happened, as are a fair number of Belloc's other books. And I would highly recommend anyone who's not familiar with Belloc to pick up almost any. Probably the best one to pick up would be his most popular book, which is The Path to Rome, which he wrote in 1902. So it's one of his earliest books. He was only 32 when he wrote it. But it's a marvelous story about walking from the small French town where he'd done his military service all the way to Rome and what he discovered along the way. So The Path to Rome might be a good place to start. But really any of Belloc's historical or biographical works would also be very good.
Yeah, excellent. Very good. And speaking of excellent works, where can people go to pick up your own writings?
Well, easiest at Amazon. And I would point out that I'm going to be having a new book come out in June called Sun, Storm, and Solitude, Discovering Hidden Italy on the Camino di San Benedetto. I'm just today, as we're recording the show, about to sign off on the, not just the cover, but the layout of the text. So everything's just about done. So that should appear in June, and people can go to Amazon and pick that up.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to it, Karl. I'll have to have you on the show, and we'll talk about it.
I look forward to that, Gary. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on. Karl Keating, ladies and gentlemen. And, go to Amazon or karlkeating.com. Lots of great stuff. And, again, mark your calendars, June 13th, Men's Conference, Virgin Most Powerful Radio, and also Steve Ray's Virtual Pilgrimage on the 20th. You don't want to miss either of those events. It's already time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center, turn off the dojo lights. Thank you so much for tuning in. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye, everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.